I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, amid the gravest crisis for the transatlantic alliance in decades over the fate of Greenland, we examine the implications of Russia considering strikes on substations supplying Ukraine's nuclear power plants. Then we assess the options available to NATO allies seeking to placate President Trump, before hearing about a robot that supposedly held the line against Russian troops for 45 days, and offering an update on how Moscow is deploying Nuns as an instrument of hybrid war.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 19th of January, 3 years and 331 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell, who's about to fly to Greenland, and foreign reporter, Verity Bowman. But first, as ever, over to Dom for the latest military updates.
So, Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy grid continued over the weekend. President Zelensky said on Telegram that repairing the country's energy system remained challenging. Quote, but we are doing everything we can to restore everything as quickly as possible. Now, on Saturday, Ukraine's military intelligence directorate and President Zelensky's office warned that Russia is considering strikes on the electricity substations supplying Ukraine's nuclear power plants. They say Russia is trying to disconnect the power plants, there are 5 in Ukraine, disconnect the nuclear power plants from the energy grid, further impacting Ukrainian civilians and their access to electricity and heat. Now, Russian strikes recently have threatened Ukrainian-controlled nuclear power plants, and on Friday, the International Atomic Energy Agency Director General, Rothwell, he said that military activity had damaged one of the electrical substations critical to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. That's about 50 km north of Kyiv, up near the Belarusian border. Now, Mr. Grossi stated that IAEA teams have reported military activities or air raid alarms at all 5 nuclear sites in Ukraine just over the last week. Now, they say they are going to send a team to assess 10 substations critical to the whole nuclear safety grid, although they haven't put a date on that. Now, on Saturday night, as if to underline Mr. Grossi's comments, Ukraine's Air Force said that Russia had fired 201 drones at Ukraine. 30 got through air defence, hit 15 locations, including critical infrastructure in Kharkiv and Zaporizhia cities and across Odessa Oblast. 5 people were killed in Kharkiv and Kherson Oblast, and at least 30 others killed in a swathe from sort of north around to the east and south. Chernihiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Sumy, Donetsk and Zaporizhia Oblast in particular. On Friday, the UNICEF, so that's the UN agency dedicated to protecting children's rights, they said children's lives are still consumed by thoughts of survival, not childhood in Ukraine. Extreme winter and devastating impacts of attacks on vital infrastructure impacting children's physical and mental health. Now, just to give you an idea of how cold it is, Jimmy Rushton, who's contributed to this pod, he said, to give you an idea of how cold it is in Kyiv right now, the Dnipro, the massive river that splits the city in half, is now nearly completely frozen. People are ice fishing, skating and walking from one riverbank to the other, he says. On Saturday, a volunteer fundraising platform in Poland announced that it's raised 1.2 million Polish zloty. That's about $330,000 US. This is for purchasing generators for Kyiv. Now, this program was launched under the name Warmth from Poland for Kyiv, initially set out to just, try and raise 400 zloty. It's ended up raising 3 times that amount. On the ground, across the country, very little movement. However, in the northeast, Russian forces continued to attack around Kupiansk over the weekend. Ukrainian forces said to have counterattacked. Interestingly, up there, Russian mail bloggers continue to criticise and push back against Russian MOD's fabricated claims about the situation in the vicinity of Kupiansk. So, Russian MOD is saying that they still hold the city. That is demonstrably false, and Russian mill bloggers are pointing it out. They say a lot of Russian commanders are seizing settlements on credit, as they say, by which they mean Russian commanders on the ground are sending reports of false seizures up the chain of command. Now, the Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, says that Russian mill bloggers have been increasingly refuting the Russian military command's persistent false claims that Russian forces have retaken Kupiansk, despite ample geolocated evidence to the contrary. Also, over the weekend, Russia released a video claiming it struck a Patriot missile system somewhere near Kharkiv that had been moved up there in recent days. But then that claim started to be walked back again by the Russian mill blogger community, who are saying actually, on closer examination, they think it's actually a high-quality decoy that was hit. They point to certain inconsistencies, such as the amount of stands that's holding up the radar and that kind of thing. I think it was a dummy hit. Also on Saturday, Italian authorities detained a cargo ship in the port of Brindisi, right down in the southeast of Italy, on suspicion of violating European Union sanctions targeting Russia. The ship, which was said to be flying the flag of Tuvalu, was intercepted after arrival in Brindisi. Investigators believe the cargo of iron briquettes was shipped from Novorossiysk on Russia's Black Sea coast using falsified documents and deliberate GPS shutdowns in order to hide its location. Italian police said that the ship's declared documentation showed serious inconsistencies, falsifications and alterations related both to the ship's cargo, the origin of it, and the port activity. Authorities were able to reconstruct the ship's route and its sanctioned operations despite what they say were deceptive declarations by the ship's captain and attempts to obstruct the investigation. We believe the cargo has been seized and 4 people said to be under investigation. Now then, the Coalition of the Willing, remember that? That held an online meeting yesterday, Sunday, at the level of armed forces commanders-in-chief, so the heads of the military, continuing the discussion about security guarantees. Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief General Alexander Syrsky said, "I emphasise the importance of further strengthening sanctions pressure on Russia so that the cost of the war becomes prohibitive." That seems to be the most exciting outcome from that meeting. And then just a couple more from me. Looking inside Russia, this morning The Guardian are reporting that Ukrainian drone strikes over the weekend damaged energy networks in Russia-occupied parts of southern Ukraine. So this is not actually in Russia, this is in the occupied territories, which they say has left hundreds of thousands of people without power. This comes from the Kremlin-installed authorities there. Now, more than 200,000 households, The Guardian says, in the occupied part of southern Ukraine's Zaporizhia region had no electricity on Sunday. This comes from the Kremlin-installed local governor, who says nearly 400 settlements have had their supply cut because of damage to power networks from Ukrainian drone strikes. This is Yevgeny Belitsky speaking on Telegram. Now, that followed claims also yesterday by the Atash partisan group, who said they'd sabotaged an electrical substation in Russia's Bryansk Oblast, disrupting the power supply to what they say was a key component of Russia's military. The group claimed that the sabotage operation disrupted power supply to the Polpinskaya railway station. That's just outside the city of Bryansk, about 100 k's north of Ukraine. They say that area, or that station, supplies Russian equipment and ammunition to the front line in Ukraine. So not a huge amount of movement on the, very little on the ground, but not a huge amount of movement on the military front. But that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks, Dom. Things may be quieter in military terms, but in the political realm, you join us amid the most serious crisis for the transatlantic relationship since Suez in the 1950s. We left you after that meeting of Denmark and Greenlander officials last week at the White House, which ended with them saying it was clear the US had not abandoned its stance to control Greenland. Many hoped the temperature might lower over the weekend, but the opposite was true, with President Trump threatening 25% tariffs on a slew of European countries, European allies, including Denmark, Germany, France and the UK, until the US is allowed to purchase the island. This despite European countries bending over backwards for months in an attempt to sate Trump and try and contain his transactional approach to foreign policy. But then came a publicly released letter which, depending on what happens next, could live in infamy. Addressing the Prime Minister of Norway, Trump said his plan to take over Greenland was motivated by his being snubbed for the Nobel Peace Prize. I think it's worth hearing in full. "Dear Jonas," it reads, "considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace. Although it will always be predominant, but can now think about what is good and proper for the United States of America. Denmark cannot protect that land from Russia or China, and why do they have the right of ownership anyway? There are no written documents. It's only that a boat landed there hundreds of years ago, but we had boats landing there also. I've done more for NATO than any other person since its founding, and now NATO should do something for the United States. The world is not secure unless we have complete and total control of Greenland. Thank you, President DJT. The reaction among European leaders is a mixture of horror, anger and despair, frankly. To be clear, that wasn't a Truth Social post. That was a formal letter to the Norwegians. And in a separate public post overnight, Trump said, and I quote, "NATO has been telling Denmark for 20 years that you have to get the Russian threat away from Greenland. Unfortunately, Denmark has been unable to do anything about it. Now it is time, and it will be done." Now that landed just as a Danish newspaper revealed the US last year attempted to gather sensitive information about military bases, air bases and ports in Greenland. Now, just let's be frank about this. There is no direct threat to Greenland from Russia or China, for that matter. Greenland is under the umbrella of NATO, for one, and the ships that Trump keeps referencing are not military in nature. While there are concerns over Greenland because of its importance for strategic defence long term, the idea that that can only be solved by America annexing the territory is an absurdity. Now, as a consequence of all of this, the EU has no other option but to consider a trade war with the United States. A diplomatic source told The Telegraph on Sunday the EU was readying a €93 billion retaliatory tariff package against US exports to the bloc. The British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, gave a rare public statement in Downing Street this morning, warning of the huge damage that would be done if the White House pursued this course. But he did fall short of threatening tariff retaliation. I think London is still desperate to maintain dialogue, but Starmer made it clear that the sovereignty of Greenland was a red line for his government, something echoed by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and French President Emmanuel Macron over the weekend. Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, suggested that Trump's threats might be based on a misunderstanding about Danish-led joint exercises in Greenland last week. But if so, it wouldn't explain Trump's rhetoric before those took place. It's very telling that not even the so-called populist patriotic parties the White House said it wanted to support in its national security strategy are on board with this approach. The AfD in Germany and the National Front in France have both spoken out against Trump. But there is a very real risk of spiralling here, which naturally would have huge consequences for Ukraine as well. European governments have adopted rhetoric very rarely seen when addressing the US over this. And in response, Washington may broaden its pressure campaign beyond the economic sphere and into the security domain. Initial steps could include curtailing arms transfers to Kyiv or, once again, limiting intelligence cooperation, before progressing to measures that could directly undermine NATO cohesion, including, say, the selective redeployment or withdrawal of US forces stationed in Europe. As Shashank Joshi of The Economist says, within the current administration there is a firm conviction that the US retains decisive control over the escalation ladder, and that European capitals will ultimately choose accommodation over confrontation. But that reasoning rests on the presumption that decision makers will always have freedom of manoeuvre, always have the freedom to pull back from the precipice. History shows time and time again that events often have a habit of accelerating beyond political intent. The decision you thought you'd be able to make is taken away from you, particularly when it involves troops potentially firing on each other. Now, tomorrow, the US Supreme Court is due to hand down its next set of rulings on the legality of President Trump's global tariffs. That could also limit Trump's options to just the military. As the EU's foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas pleaded over the weekend, China and Russia must be having a field day. They are the ones who benefit from divisions among allies. We also cannot let our dispute distract us from our core task of helping to end Russia's war against Ukraine. What many here in Europe are finding particularly galling is that Trump is citing the threat of Russia as a primary motivator of his actions. But at the same time, he's just invited Putin to be on his Gaza peace board, just as Dmitriev, that key player in the peace talks, is gloating that the transatlantic alliance is over. Meanwhile, tariffs on Moscow are still at 0%, despite the war and despite them being a key ally of Iran. Watching this from London, where of course our former leaders remain active in politics even after their tenure in power is over, quite often former prime ministers still sit in the House of Commons. It's less common than it used to be, but even so. The silence from former US presidents is just deafening. I had a look at the last social media posts of US presidents this morning. Biden hasn't posted since Christmas. Obama's last posts were birthday messages and his festive recommended reading and viewing lists. George W. Bush has released no statement, and neither has the Clintons, although they did do something about the ICE agents a few days ago. But when so much is at stake, can this be justified, even when the convention is normally for presidents to remain in the background? I just mention this because it feels very foreign and very alien to European eyes. And in a sign of just how much the Overton window has shifted under Trump, especially when it comes to what's considered acceptable political behaviour and rhetoric, I saw one commentator argue that the Nixon, Clinton and Trump impeachments were triggered by far less than this. Yet, of course, no one seems to now be seriously talking about impeachment as a possibility. Appeasement is a word often used in relation to Putin, but I think it's one that will increasingly be used about Trump too. I'll end by quoting a piece by renowned foreign policy analyst Robert Kagan in The Atlantic. He puts the consequences of all of this starkly. The American-dominated liberal world order is over. The American might that upheld the world order of the past 80 years will now be used instead to destroy it. Americans are entering the most dangerous world they have known since World War II, one that will make the Cold War look like child's play and the post-Cold War world like paradise. In fact, this new world will look a lot like the world prior to 1945, with multiple great powers and competition and conflict. The US will have no reliable allies and will have to depend entirely on its own strength to survive and prosper. This will require more military spending, not less, because the open access to overseas resources, markets and strategic bases that Americans have enjoyed will no longer come as a benefit of the country's alliances. Instead, they will have to be contested and defended against other great powers. Precisely to escape this cycle of conflict, the generations of Americans who lived through 2 world wars laid the foundations of the American-led liberal world order. They were the true realists because they had no illusions about multipolarity. They had lived their entire lives with its horrific consequences. The new multipolar world will not have the same qualities as the one that prevailed 2 centuries ago. Metternich's Austria was a status quo power, interested only in protecting a conservative order against its liberal challengers. Bismarck regarded his newly unified Germany in the late 19th century as satiated. They both sought an equilibrium to hold on to what they had, not to get more. But China and Russia are not status quo powers. They are dissatisfied, have-not powers. Since the end of the Cold War, they have been chronically unhappy with American global supremacy and sought to restore what they regard as their natural and traditional regional dominance. We'll, of course, link to that piece from The Atlantic in our show notes. But Dom, in what feels like another momentous week for global affairs, I wonder what your reflections are on Greenland and Trump's actions.
Yeah, I think this is a very serious moment. It's really quite concerning and it's ridiculous. It is literally, it would be worthy of ridiculous if it weren't so serious. The whole Greenland thing, if you want to play the game for a moment, I don't believe it's anything about security, but let's play the game for a moment and try and talk about security. There are sufficient mechanisms already for Donald Trump and the White House administration to address any security concerns it has with Denmark/Greenland, the treaties that are in place that have been renewed, the bases that are there. There's the idea that you mentioned last week. It will take the model of the British military presence on Cyprus with the sovereign base areas, the two large military bases. I mean, there's more, but the two areas known as the sovereign base areas, clues in the title. It's sovereign British territory. It's on Cyprus, but it is sovereign British territory. So there's a model you could copy if you wanted to have that discussion with Denmark about having sovereign US soil on Greenland. So you could address these things if you wanted to. And secondly, it's an incoherent and short-sighted policy. Donald Trump all of a sudden is saying that Russia and China is this massive military threat. Well, I know he doesn't think about day two or doesn't think any broader, but just please somebody explain it to him. If Russia and China are such a massive threat to you, such you're taking this action over Greenland potentially, then one of the best things you can do is punch Russia on the nose right now, Ukraine, and that would concurrently send a message to China that you don't get to mess around on the world stage like that, chum. Sorry, that's not how it's done. So you could see off these security challenges, if you so wished, very, very easily, not only through existing mechanisms in Greenland, but also through your foreign policy in regards to Ukraine, neither of which he's prepared to do. So, I don't think it's anything to do with security. It's all about the minerals underneath. But everyone's just too polite to call him out on that. But it is serious. I don't know what's going to happen in Greenland, but regardless, let's say Europe rolls over and the US gets some kind of ownership of Greenland. Does Putin at that point, does he think, oh, well, if Europe's going to roll over for Trump, I can't mind too much about it because at the end of the day, they're all pals and they're going to do whatever they can to stick together? Or is he going to think, no, they're weak, they are disunited, now's the time for me to increase the pressure? So I think it is very, very serious. A couple more. It's been said the British government have been criticised for not speaking openly against the US administration, not just about this, but about other issues. And we've always been told there's been sort of nods and winks and taps and, but we're chatting in the background. That's the better way to elicit a sensible response. And maybe it is. And I do prefer those sort of background chats to having the in-public spats and Twitter storm and all the rest of it. So fine. So Britain apparently has been wielding its massive influence in the background. Well, Keir Starmer came out this morning, that very public statement, as in literally a public statement, and it was quite pointed. It was quite clear where he stands. Greenland is for Greenland and Denmark to decide the future of. But equally, he said they weren't going to reciprocate if there's a tariff war. But this is a public statement by Starmer. So if Britain is ignored now, then that puts the lie to the whole thing about, actually, we got massive influence in the back door behind the scenes. And that takes me on to my final point, that if that is the case, if it's proper emperor's new clothes type, Britain, actually, you don't have any great influence over the United States, then the one glimmer of hope I would take from that is that it would put to bed once and for all this ridiculous idea of a special relationship between Britain and the United States. Basically, Britain's been going, we might be a diminishing power, but we've got this special relationship with the United States, and blah, blah, blah. It might work on the Five Eyes and the intelligence sharing area, very close military allies there, but to take it any more broad than that there's a special relationship between Britain and the United States, I think it's ridiculous. And I think actually it might take something like this for the British Pol Mill fraternity, the politicians and the military, to finally have to acknowledge, it's not there. We might share some values, but it's very much transactional, and we're an alliance when it suits us. No permanent friends, just permanent interests, all that kind of thing. So it would put to bed once and for all this idea of any kind of special relationship behind which Britain has been hiding for years across many, many different areas of public policy. So that would be the one glimmer of hope I would take from it. But no, I think I'm not trying to make light of it at all. I think this is a very serious moment, and it's so stupid. It really doesn't have to happen. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I don't know why people can't get through to Donald Trump and say, just look at what you're doing. Don't worry, you've got your legacy. You're going to be remembered. Your Wikipedia page is sorted. We're going to remember you. You don't have to be remembered for all the stupid things that you are potentially about to do.
Well, thanks, Dom, very much for your reflections. Let's stick with Greenland and hear now from our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell, who I know is currently throwing things in a suitcase before being deployed to the island for the Telegraph Foreign Desk. James, what's your read on the diplomatic temperature?
Well, I think the mood has changed hugely since this absolutely extraordinary letter came out. The big debate has been whether this was really about security or whether it might have been about raw materials. Now, overnight, a third overarching sort of reason has come into the mix, which is basically the president's ego. And I think that makes the whole situation feel so much more volatile than it was last week. And it is, I suspect, going to fuel a lot of concern in Greenland in particular. Of course, the Greenlanders have said quite resolutely that they want to decide what their future is. It's going to fuel a lot of concern for them that this whole situation is at risk of actually getting a little bit unhinged. Now, some Trump watchers will say, oh, this is all part of the MO of the Trump administration. It's all about making big maximalist demands first so that they can kind of force their negotiating partner closer to their own position. But we've never seen anything like this before, Francis. A letter basically saying that not being given a prize was a primary factor in pursuing Greenland. So we'll just have to see. We'll just have to see what happens next, I suppose.
What options are on the table for Greenland's NATO allies here and Greenland itself, James? Because if we're to take a step back here, obviously war is one in the sense of shooting back if American troops try to make some sort of move on this. But I know you wrote a piece that was reflecting on some of the other options that were on the table.
Yes, that's right. I mean, first of all, the huge issue here, and this is the first thing that comes up actually when you talk to, for example, Danish security experts, is that the whole crisis at the moment is predicated on a claim about imminent Russian and Chinese military threats, which the Danes say do not exist. The Trump administration says that Greenland is basically covered in Russian and Chinese ships all over the place, and that is his rationale for pushing this issue so aggressively at the moment. And the Danish government, Danish security experts, and even the Swedish defense minister, who I interviewed last week, have all said the same thing. There aren't huge numbers of Russian and Chinese vessels all over the place. Yes, there are some, in very small number, Chinese research ships perhaps, but not military. And so their big concern, to come back to the point of the question, is what can they actually do? They are facing the prospect of perhaps being invaded and taken over, a supposedly imminent Chinese and Russian military threat that they themselves say does not exist. So their options are really very limited, because the obvious alternative to an invasion or a forced annexation would, of course, be negotiations. But how can you negotiate with someone who is basing their entire reason for coming and taking you over on the presence of ships that are in fact not there? And that's a huge dilemma, particularly for the Danes, as they outlined it to me last week. Now, the other issue here is that there are, and again, I'm speaking through the Danish security expert perspective here, so just bear that in mind. But the other issue here is that there's all sorts of things that you can do without actually annexing Greenland. So, for example, if the Americans wanted to hugely increase the number of American troops on the island, for the sake of argument, if they wanted to hugely increase other elements of security equipment over there, they would be pushing on an open door. The Danes would be very, very happy to accommodate that. They are part of a security alliance. They are on the same side. As far as they are concerned, more American military tech or personnel arriving to address a long-term security concern about Chinese and Russian expansion in the future, and that is a real concern, they'd be very happy with that. So that would be one of the options on the table. I spoke to a couple of experts who said there's a whole load of precedent in terms of deepening Danish and American cooperation and working together in terms of figuring out what the real security concerns are, what issues need to be addressed now. And so you would think that there would be space to have an open dialogue on that. The Danes, for example, have pledged to hugely increase surveillance around Greenland. And that is because they accept that there are a couple of Chinese research vessels around there. And in the long term, there are concerns that Russia and China in the future might start to take, or will start to take, a much greater interest in this territory. This brings us to another one of the kind of huge issues with this whole row, which is that Denmark is now actually being criticised for making that offer to President Trump. It was Denmark which said, we recognise your security concerns, we want to do something about it, and so we've put together this defence package in the region of about £4.8 billion, and we're going to offer that in order to appease your security concerns about Russia and China. That package included, by the way, the expansion of the Sirius Patrol, a kind of snow sled riding special forces reconnaissance unit that Denmark has. The Trump reaction to that, as you know, Francis, was to start making fun of Denmark and to say, oh, the only thing that they did in order to increase their security was introduce some dog sleds. So on the Danish side, the huge concern here is that they cannot really negotiate in good faith. When they try to appease the Trump administration, they are mocked. And of course, as we saw over the weekend, if Denmark or other European countries lay out their opposition to this move by Mr. Trump, they are threatened with tariffs.
Absolutely. I think you lay out the conundrum very clearly, James, and it's fundamentally, how can you reason with an irrational player? And that is what is trying to be navigated at the moment without seemingly much success. But you mentioned Sweden, and I know that you spent some time in Sweden recently, and there's another story that we're going to talk about in a moment, which is a follow-up to the Nuns story that we spoke about several months ago on the podcast. But first of all, I'm very interested in your take on this crisis in Sweden at the moment and the general atmosphere.
Yes, that's right. Well, I spoke to Sweden's defence minister last week, and we had a very kind of broad conversation about the security challenges for Sweden. We inevitably talked a lot about the Arctic, and as I said earlier, he actually quite bravely, I think you could say, stuck his neck over the parapet and said the Donald Trump claims about Russian and Chinese ships are an exaggeration. He was doing that at a time last week when basically everybody else in the European Union was staying way clear of engaging on that issue of whether this key claim about huge numbers of Russian and Chinese ships was even true. He stood up and said he felt that it was not true. The Swedes are trying to give as much support as they can to Denmark diplomatically, but also militarily. He said that they were having some discussions about what troops they might be able to send over to sort of appease that concern about there not being enough security in Greenland. And this is Paul Jonsson, by the way, the Swedish defence minister. The other point that he made is that Sweden is investing very heavily in satellite surveillance technology. They think that's going to be hugely important, not just in terms of the Arctic, but generally in terms of this wider space race that you may have heard about, this idea that there's going to be increased competition for the military sphere of space in the near future as well. And so that's kind of where Sweden's focus is at the moment, I think.
Interesting, and we'll link to your reporting from Sweden in the show notes. But I'm really interested, James, in an update on this story of pro-Putin spy nuns. Now, I think it was Estonia before that we were talking about in relation to this, but you've been looking into this in the Swedish context.
Yes, that's right, Francis. So a few months ago, we did a story about this convent in Estonia, which maintained that it was just a sort of house of innocent women of God and that all they wanted to do out there was pray. But the Estonian government strongly disagreed and accused them of being a sort of de facto wing of the Russian intelligence services spreading pro-Putin propaganda. Fascinating story. There's been a similar incident in Sweden where a Belarusian convent, which according to the Church of Sweden has links to Russian intelligence, turned up in some rural parishes, Täby is one of them near Stockholm, to raise funds. They were at Christmas markets, they set up little stalls, they were selling religious icons, religious trinkets, and they were kind of moving around from parish to parish, not just in Sweden, but also in Norway as well. And one parish in particular, as I said, Täby, was at the centre of this national outcry, really, because pictures of these pro-Putin nuns selling their trinkets went viral. Ukrainian media picked it up, Swedish media picked it up, and before long the rector of Täby was having to sort of fend off a lot of very kind of hostile questions in the media about what on earth he was thinking when he invited these nuns over. While I was in Sweden to interview the defence minister, I went over to Täby to find out more about this and uncovered, I think, a story that tells us a lot about the church in Russian hybrid warfare. We know that Russian hybrid warfare is mainly about sabotaging arms factories, and sometimes it's about assassinating people, but there's a big focus on propaganda as well, and kind of advancing Kremlin narratives, particularly the narrative that the people of NATO countries don't agree with their governments on Ukraine. is really, really key to them. And what became clear after talking to the rector is that what happened here is that he had no idea of the really lurid allegations against these nuns, such as that they are kind of funding, allegedly, the Russian war machine. And he saw this as an opportunity for dialogue between Christians on two sides of a border. He absolutely was not doing this with intentions. He was, if anything, he was actually honouring this long-term goal that he has as a vicar in Sweden of inviting people from dictatorships over so that they can experience democracy for themselves. But what he said he now accepts after this media furor is that if you allow these pro-Putin nuns to come to your church and sell trinkets and wares, it contributes to this narrative of, oh, you know, the Putin supporters are being welcomed in Sweden. This is a suggestion that actually the people of Sweden who are in NATO agree with us, Russia and indeed Belarus, and they disagree with their own governments. And he said that once that propaganda element to this little scandal was pointed out to him, he changed his position and he's now cut ties with the nuns and they're not being again.
And it, of course, follows attempts, as you say in the piece, by the Orthodox Church to manipulate Swedish churches into lending buildings which are close to military bases and airports. And I just wonder, the other element of this, James, which I remember we spoke about when you first reported on this story in the Estonian context, is that it might be used as a future justification by Russia for potentially even moving in little green men to protect so-called religious minorities in countries. Is that a concern for Sweden as well?
I think that definitely in the case of Estonia, that's a deep anxiety about that particular monastery that we talked about earlier. I think it's probably less of an issue in Sweden because they're less, if you like, geographically exposed to that, because the monastery in Estonia is actually very, very close to the Russian border. However, yes, it's absolutely right that incidents like this can sometimes be used to create a wider narrative of bullying or hostility towards the Russian Orthodox Church and its members. Whether the Russians could convincingly make that argument in Sweden is an interesting question, because it was actually Sweden that allowed the Russian Orthodox Church to build a huge church right next to a strategically critical airport in Sweden. This happened some years ago, before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Swedes now bitterly regret it, and they're trying to get the church closed down. But it was kind of an astonishing moment when the fact that that was allowed to happen became clear a few years ago. And the criticism of Sweden, of course, is that it was perhaps unwittingly too welcoming to the Russian Orthodox Church as a result of allowing it to build that compound right next to an airport, Västerås Airport, which is what's called a contingency airport in Sweden. It's used for crisis planning, basically. It's clearly an airport that the Russians are very interested in. So, yes, it can be used to kind of advance those sorts of narratives. But the strange thing about Sweden is it's actually what became clear from this trip actually was that Sweden was one of the countries, and of course it's only recently joined NATO and it's traditionally been a very neutral country. It was one that was considered quite ripe for Russian espionage because they didn't get such a hostile welcome. But that, of course, is now changing.
Absolutely. And just to conclude, James, I was reading your piece earlier on and you actually visited the compound, an interesting word to use for what's ostensibly a church. What was the vibe like there at this Orthodox institution?
It was a strange place. It was down a country road. It felt like it was in the middle of nowhere, really, although there were some residential buildings on the other side. It's right next to the airport itself. You can almost see the airport, actually, when you're standing outside the church. Big locked gates up front, CCTV cameras all over the place, lots of signs telling people to go away. This is not the kind of vibe that one would expect from church in Sweden of any religious denomination.
No.
You know, if all of that sounds incredibly suspicious, by the way, Francis, the Swedish intelligence services would agree with you.
We're not being conspiracy theorists here.
Yes. They, of course, say that they believe that this church is indeed being used for intelligence gathering. And there were no signs of life in the church either. I mean, I spoke to some young men who were on their way to play football going past this church. And they said, well, we've never seen anyone come in and out. It seems to be completely there seems to be nothing going on. I know that over the summer, people were going in and out to take part in religious services. So it clearly does offer religious services. And the city authorities in Västerås said that as far as they're aware, there's only 50 people in the Russian Orthodox community in their city. So why such an enormous church, a lavish church with the onion domes and the big gold crosses? It's a really quite impressive building when you see it. Why one so grand was required, I think, is also part of the debate there.
Mm. Well, James, fascinating to hear your insights on that story, and do continue to tug at the, can I say this, tug at the nuns habit? I'm not sure that's appropriate really, but you know what I mean, and pursue this story further, because I know to say you've been working on it for a long time, and it's really, really interesting to see how far this goes in terms of Russian activities on European soil. And of course, good luck in Greenland. We'll all be following your reporting and look forward to having you on the podcast.
Thank you, Francis. That sounds great. And I'll speak to you again soon.
Take care for now. Let's turn to our foreign reporter, Verity Bowman now, who often does deep dives for us on the battlefield situation in Ukraine. Verity, welcome back. First of all, you want to tell us about a Ukrainian billionaires battalion. Interested to hear more on this.
Yeah, Francis, well, thank you for having me on today. It's always great to be back. So my article focused on Ukraine's Katia Brigade and its role in recent fighting around the city of Kupiansk. And it also had a look at the billionaire who founded the unit, who's called Vsevolod Kozomyako. So this week, the Katia Brigade raised the Ukrainian flag over Kupiansk. There's loads of photographs of this, sort of a dramatic moment of the ruins of this council building and the flag on top. And it marked a really successful pushback of Russian forces and, of course, delivered a very big morale boost when Ukraine needs it. So Kozomyako's unit has basically evolved from what was initially a makeshift project for him, sort of a uneven mix of civilian volunteers and elite equipment that he could fund with his own wealth, and how it's now become a force that has led precision counterattacks on one of the most lethal sections of the front line. And I think the operation in Kupiansk has sent a really clear signal that Kyiv's forces are not yet yielding to Russia's sort of meat grinder tactics, which we've spoken a lot about. And it's also cemented this brigade, so Katia, it cemented their reputation as one of the most effective units currently available to Ukraine.
Thanks, Verity. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about the background to its founding.
Yeah, so Katia was founded in March 2022, in the early weeks of the full-scale invasion. And it was at a time when the country was urgently mobilising civilian volunteers to defend key areas. So the unit was established by Kozomyako, and he used his personal resources to help organise and equip a light infantry battalion. Initially, as we said, Katia was made up by, largely civilian volunteers, and it was attached to the 127th Territorial Defence Brigade in Kharkiv. While it operated within Ukraine's military command structure, the unit benefited from private funding, including donations from other wealthy Ukrainians. Kozomyako had managed to rally behind the cause. And this funding model led to it getting a bit of a fun, informal nickname as the Billionaires Battalion. And now, as the war has progressed, Katia has evolved from a volunteer formation into a formal unit within Ukraine's National Guard under the Ministry of Internal Affairs. It's expanded from a battalion into a brigade and later into a large corps structure, so it reflects its growing manpower and operational effectiveness. So what began as an improvised wartime initiative with this very wealthy man backing it has since developed into one of Ukraine's more capable assault formations.
Thanks, Verity. What more can you tell us about this billionaire?
Yeah, so as we said, behind all of this is Kozomyako, and he is a figure whose background has attracted attention because of this really big contrast between his pre-war life and his current role. So before the invasion, all over his Instagram page showed this kind of luxury lifestyle. He was an extensive international traveller. There's photos of him skiing in the Alps, photos of him running, cycling, playing golf. So this man, he's the founder and chief executive of Agri-Trade Group, which is one of Ukraine's largest grain producer and exporters. So as well as this flash lifestyle of gallivanting around the Alps, he was also running a staff of 1,500 people. And since the start of the war, his focus has really shifted almost entirely to the conflict and to the development of Cartier as a fighting force.
Interesting. Well, thanks very much for that, Verity. We'll certainly link to that. And there was also an interesting article in The Economist recently about how these brigades may be a stepping stone to post-war political power, which might explain why billionaires want to put themselves forward for working on this. But if you've got any thoughts on that, obviously feel free to offer. But also, I'm very interested in a story that's been put out there by the Ukrainians into a certain robot.
Yeah, so this story, you can question it a little bit. You can couch the whole situation, but there's been reportedly, according to Ukraine, a new development in terms of technology that they're using. And there is this unmanned ground vehicle that they've been using to hold frontline positions. And this one is called the Dev Droid TW-12-7, and it has been deployed by Ukraine's Third Army. And this court claims that this robot kind of held off Russian troops for 45 consecutive days and held them from advancing despite repeated assaults and attempts by Russia to exploit poor weather conditions, rain, fog, snow, all being taken advantage of right now. So Ukrainian commanders claim that this position appeared to be defended by dozens of soldiers spread across multiple firing points, but in reality it was a single unmanned ground vehicle.
Thank you. And just can you talk us through what this robot's technical capabilities are and how it's operated? The footage is quite staggering, if it's what it purports to be.
Yeah, so the Dev Droid is actually roughly the size of a ride-on lawnmower, and it's armed with a 50 caliber machine gun. It's operated remotely by Ukrainian soldiers from distances of up to around 15 miles away, and it can also reportedly navigate terrain using an AI-assisted guidance system. Its top speed is just over 4 miles per hour, and this system was developed by the NC-13 Strike Company, and this is a specialised unit within Ukraine's Third Army that focuses on unmanned ground vehicles. And I spoke to the unit's commander when I was writing this article, Michael Zinkovich. He said that the Dev Droid was positioned in multiple forward locations over this claimed 45-day period. He said that every 2 days, the drone left its position for maintenance, ammunition resupply and battery recharging, and that this was carried out by a crew roughly 2.5 miles behind the front line. So, its role was straightforward: deliver sustained machine gun fire to deter Russian advances and protect Ukrainian troops positioned further back. So this commander claimed that Russian forces attempted daily attacks, often using poor visibility to move in small groups. But he said that the machine gun fire held every advance, without a single Ukrainian soldier occupying the forward position. He said that Russians actually didn't even realise that the position was being defended by a machine rather than the troops. And no electronic intercepts were recorded, and the vehicle wasn't hit. He said that the Dev Droid allowed a position that would normally require 3 to 6 soldiers to be held by a single system. And as he put it, quote, "Wherever a live soldier can be replaced by a machine, it should be." I think all of this, whether we're taking it at face value or not, it highlights how unmanned systems are increasingly reshaping the battlefield. We have aerial drones, ground-based robots, are now being used alongside them to conduct reconnaissance, deliver firepower, and hold territory, all while reducing the risk to personnel. So other versions of the Dev Droid, including models that are equipped with grenade launchers, have recently been approved for the front line. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on there. And I think as well, a quote that stuck with me from the commander was that he said, "Robots do not bleed." And that's why it's so important.
Interesting. Well, certainly Ukraine has been pioneers in this regard. And yeah, it's interesting to see them claiming this as a huge success for them, and obviously with caveats apply, but it's very much worth reading the piece that you did on this, Verity, because the footage, as I say, is quite extraordinary. But let's go to our final thoughts now, and Dom, I know you've got a few thoughts on this story yourself.
Yes, a couple of final thoughts, if I may. And Verity, I'm going to take you up on your offer of questioning that story a little bit. I'm afraid I'm very firmly in the camp of it never happened, or it's an experimental thing. It might be fine shooting some rounds, but I can't believe that this robot on its own, which is what they're claiming, held a position for 45 days. Look, we are told that personnel can't advance in Ukraine without being hit by a drone, and yet this robot managed to stay unscathed for 45 days, we are told. Also, we're told it moved position up and down the line, unsupported by other infantry, but moved position, so obviously it wasn't always in the same place, and it had to be pulled back to be maintained and resupplied every few days. So what I'm saying is that there were gaps in the line which was not suddenly flooded by Russian troops, these infiltration troops running forward. So I wonder if the lack of any Russian advance in this area is less to do with an invincible killer robot and more to do with geography. I'm wondering if this is one of the areas of Ukraine that is just too open to allow free movement. I'm thinking the area north of Kharkiv, just south of Vovchansk, where that Russian lodgement is. We've been up there. These are huge open areas. It's not like two lines of trenches directly facing each other. There's just too much open ground that's observed, and everything gets hit by drones if they try and move. So I wonder if that might be happening here. Also, the weapons are 50 cal, so 50 caliber as in half an inch, 0.5 of an inch. That's the caliber of the weapon. That's a big machine gun. I mean, it hurts if it hits you. But when we talk about automatic weapons, we talk about a thing called the beaten zone. So when you fire a weapon, it's not sniper rifle. Each round doesn't follow the last one exactly. It kind of goes bang, 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 and you cover a whole swathe of ground in front of you, a big lozenge. If you can imagine a few hundred metres in front of your barrel, this lozenge that's long, fairly narrow, because that's the spread of rounds on the ground. And what you can't do with a machine gun like this, or from a tank, is what's called hose piping. So you can't fire and then waggle it left and right, spraying in rounds all over the place, because they just go everywhere, make a hell of a lot of noise. Somebody somewhere will be hit, but it's not very effective. So if Russia, as we know, has a very low moral bar for treating their troops, if they wanted to take this position, they could just run at this thing and a few people would get hit. But because the rounds are going to be splayed everywhere, somebody will get up to it and disable it and stick a grenade on it or what have you. So I think it would be very helpful. These things must be very helpful, used alongside soldiers, used as part of an integrated defence. But I simply cannot believe the story that it on its own held a position for 45 days and the Russians, if they so wanted, could not get beyond it. So I don't doubt what we've seen, the footage we've seen, this thing firing away. I just doubt the story that it held off countless Russian attempts to get past it for 45 days.
But we can understand why the Ukrainians want to claim that.
Yeah, but fine. But just don't be scared then, fellas. If we apply a little bit of sensible military logic and go, I think it's a load of old bollocks, Brigadier, pardon my French. Right, second final thought. I just want to say thank you. So Friday I was talking about the Ukraine-UK Schools Partnership Programme, and I was talking about one of the things that the teachers were involved in was trauma-induced teaching. Of course, I meant trauma-informed teaching. This is where one approaches topics that may provoke triggering responses. You approach these topics with great care and you just think about it. So yes, it's trauma-informed teaching, not trauma-induced. Thank you to the many people who got in touch pointing out that error. Dr. Peter, thank you. Also Fernando and Chris. Chris pondered whether or not I was channeling a little bit of the UK education system when I sort of lapsed into trauma-induced teaching. But anyway, my bad. Sorry about that. Apologies. But a very interesting programme. One I'll be following up.
Indeed. Well, I've definitely had some trauma-induced teaching over the years. Verity, where would you like to leave listeners today?
Well, I think to finish off, that both Cartier and the Dev Droid sort of highlight how Ukraine is adapting to many different challenges as things are going. I think Cartier's success in Kupiansk shows how a well-planned mobile unit can push through Russia's endless meat-grinder tactics successfully. And Dev Droid, although, as Dom has said, we need to take it with a grain of salt, I think it really reflects the increasing role of technology in modern warfare.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Verity. Thank you, Dom. Thank you all very much for your time today. We will, of course, be back tomorrow on what I think is going to be another very, very interesting day, given the way that events are unfolding in real time. Until then, all the very best from us here in London for now. Goodbye. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.